Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the September 23rd, 2020 episode of the Cyber Insecurity Stream. As always, my name is Neil Bridges, and thank you for joining me today. Welcome to all of our new joiners, as well as all of our regular visitors. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday, you can catch the stream from 7 to 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. We are here to elevate the conversation around cybersecurity. Now, what exactly does that mean? We have a problem in our industry where we don't have real conversations about the topics that affect our ability to secure people, data, and companies. Sorry, got a notification there. Cybersecurity is an ever-changing landscape, and our goal is to focus on multiple aspects of that industry. You will hear terms like red teamer and blue teamer and think that you're out of your league on this stream. You're not. Trust me, you're not. We also discuss cyber risk, the impacts of our industry on the current landscape, and really the art of the possible when it comes to dealing with today's cybersecurity issues. Whether you're an experienced veteran, whether you're new to the field, whether you barely know how to spell cyber, or somebody who was born in cyber, this stream really is for you. We're here for everyone to participate and learn from this community that we're building here. Now, with that in mind, we regularly try to have professionals from all across the industry on the stream. Tonight, I'm joined by my really good friend, Roy. I'll give his introduction on the next slide. We do also have moderators in chat. The moderators are there to answer your questions. I'll be answering your questions on stream. Our special guests will be answering your questions. As you can tell, your questions are very, very important to us, and they really are the prime value that comes from our stream being live. So ask them at any time about any topic, whether something that we're covering on stream, whether it's something that's top of mind, and we'll do our absolutely best to address them. We do broadcast via Twitch for our regularly scheduled broadcast, but you can find videos in either the video section of Twitch or by viewing our YouTube channel. We are here for you, the community, and thus we strive to bring you the most intriguing opinions, points of views, and conversations in the cybersecurity industry with every single solitary stream. And so we appreciate all of our followers. We appreciate all of our subscribers. And thank you all for participating in not just this stream, but all the streams that we've had and all the future streams that we will have together. We have had a couple people donate to the stream already. I want to make it very clear that any and all donations that are donated to the stream will immediately be sent to the Wounded Warrior Foundation. We do thank all of our vets for their service and sacrifice. If you would like to support, the Wounded Warrior Foundation, go ahead and head on over to the About section of our Twitch page, and you can use the donation link over there to submit anything over to Wounded Warrior. There's obviously no obligation to do any of these things. We're going to continue to deliver this content to you, but anything you do to support the stream definitely goes to helping make sure that we keep it top of line for everybody who does participate. Now, with those logistics out of the way, let's talk about the schedule for tonight. My guest for tonight is Roy Hadley. Roy is a lawyer and trusted advisor to businesses, governments, families worldwide on a complex series of business issues involving technology, cybersecurity, and a ton of other issues. You can get to his LinkedIn profile in chat. We've updated kind of some of the functionality of Nightbot, which we kind of call Trollbot now. So if you hit ! LinkedIn, you can get to Roy's LinkedIn page. Roy, on behalf of my viewers, we thank you for being on tonight's show, and I'll turn it over to you for a few words, and expand upon your experience a little bit.
Right, pleasure is mine. Thanks, Neil. So happy to be here tonight. Not very many times does lawyers get out and converse with people. So very excited to be here. I am a lawyer, but I also have a very strong technology background. Coded. Back in the day when we had punch cards actually to code, but have continued that technology binge throughout my career, and so do a lot of blending of technology and the law in helping clients. A good case of that was the city of Atlanta's ransomware attack back in 2018. Worked with the city, and it was kind of that bridge between the legal side, law enforcement, and the technological operational side to really respond to that attack and help, the very good people at the city to get everything stood back up and operational. They did a yeoman's job. That was probably the first big ransomware attack against a municipality, or certainly the largest at that time. So, a lot of interesting things and best practices came out of that. But, a lot of things have happened since then. Attacks are getting more insidious. We'll talk about a lot of those tonight, things that are happening out there in the real world. And for me, in kind of a convoluted way, it's fun. I'm a closet geek at my core. And so this stuff is just fascinating to me in terms of what we're going to talk about tonight, but in terms of just in general, what we see out there in the cyber ethosphere. And so, that's kind of a short summary of who I am. I do a lot of work. Obviously, I'm a lawyer, but I do a lot of work with the Technology Association of Georgia here in Atlanta. I'm on the main board of TAG, but I'm also the chair of the Information Security Society. I am on the Georgia Defense Industrial Base Task Force, where we do a lot of work around CMMC, which is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, and getting companies in that defense industrial base more cyber secure. And lastly, I'm on the Atlanta CIO Task Force Advisory Board. And that's fun because what that is Gary Brantley, who is the CIO for the city of Atlanta, has leaned upon people in the cyber community and the technology community and Atlanta business leaders to say, help us, the city of Atlanta, become a world-class technology leader. So some real stuff, fun stuff is going on in the city. So yeah, just a lot to talk about tonight. And I'm excited to be here, Neil.
Thank you so very much for that, Roy, and I can't even begin to tell you how excited. And obviously, our chat's very excited. We've got Afraz in chats, was looking forward to this all day. I know there's a lot of people that are very excited to have you here. And so, as a reminder of that, remember, use that chat liberally. Looking for max participation from chat when it comes to questions for Roy as we talk about it. Real quick, just on some cyber and security points. I see that Festivus and Pawn Muncher have resubbed with their tier 1 subs. Thank you guys very much for your continued support of the stream. Also of note from a community participation perspective, for those of you who do participate in chat, if you'll notice down below at the bottom of the chat window, you'll see we've kind of changed the Planet Hacking Score logo a little bit and added some new features into the Planet Hacking Score, including what we hope to be a pretty regular giveaway challenge down in the utilizing the Planet Hacking Score stuff down there. So if you go down to the bottom, if you click on that little Planet Hacking logo down there, it'll show you how you can participate in the Planet Hacking Challenge. But we are going to go ahead and set up a giveaway challenge over the next 30 days. See if we can't hit that goal with utilizing those points that you get for participation inside a chat, and we'll see if we can't give away some cool gear. Okay. With that being said, actually, if you do have an interest in being a guest on our show, as always, make sure you shoot us a message over on LinkedIn or Twitter, and we'll figure out how to get you on there. And so with that being said, we'll kind of jump into the first sort of news topic for today. Since last week, we did kind of joke with some of the guys on stream last week about Elon Musk and about Neuralink and about something else. I did find something today. If you follow Elon Musk, you probably saw this too on Twitter, but Elon kind of found somebody who had done a kind of a oil painting mural of Elon Musk, and I thought this was interesting to share with everybody. We've got kind of that introduction to Skynet and to the Borg and everything that we're going to see going on here. now
I'm a big Skynet fan. So
are you a big Skynet fan?
Well, not Skynet fan, Terminator fan. So Skynet hits close to home. I love that painting, by the way.
Do you think Neuralink is a step in this direction?
Absolutely. I think we would be naive to think that at some point in the future, and I would say in the very near future, that concept of melding machines and minds together isn't going to happen. Yeah. And when it does, if you think about it now, just AI and the progression of AI in the last 5 years and what it's able to do You look at chess, you look at Go, and AI can consistently beat champions and do it very quickly, and AI learns, and so we're not far from it, and we're not far from enhancing, I think, human capabilities with artificial intelligence. We're already seeing it with mechanical type things, limbs, and those sorts of things. And I think it's not an illogical step to say it's going to happen with the mind at some point.
Well,
So
so it's interesting. Really, I actually wasn't. This was actually going to be one of the latter topics that I talked about today. But since
my bad.
that's okay. No, it's fine. No, because I
Right.
actually did. That was actually my bad on the lead in. But because that does lead into kind of this new article that came about in the last month about facial recognition, and the New York legislature really banning the use of facial recognition inside of schools. And I think facial recognition has been a point of contention for a while. And when you look at facial recognition, you look at Neuralink, you look at maybe some of that melding, if you will, between human flesh and technology. What are some of the legal challenges that exist with, take it facial recognition, take it Neuralink, take it any art of the possible when it comes
Right.
to technology in the future?
Well, let's start with facial recognition. I mean, it is can serve some useful purposes. You ask any law enforcement person, and they're going to say it absolutely serves useful purposes. The problem is where do you stop, and where does that right of privacy happen? So for example, do I have a right of privacy to just walk down the street? Am I subject to a search, of my being, so to speak, just walking down the street? Now, constitutionally, nowhere does it say, private, you have a right to privacy. Now, in some of the amendments, you do. Now, this is getting kind of in the weeds on the legal part, but if I'm just walking down the street, can I have the right to do that anonymously? You here in Atlanta, we don't have facial recognition cameras yet, but we've got CCTV, we've got license plate readers, we've got all kinds of technologies that stingrays in certain situations when there are rallies or protests. And the question is, what rights do you have to just be private and securing yourself by walking down the street? And we haven't fundamentally asked or answered that question here in the United States. Some countries, you think of China, they've answered the question by saying you really have no rights, and you almost get Orwellian in how they're looking at it, because in China now you get social scores, and that social score is based upon facial recognition, and it's based upon, do you jaywalk? You jaywalk, you get points taken off. You throw some paper down on the ground, you get points taken off. So what does that mean? That means that if your social score is low enough, then if you want to go on a trip, you may not be able to fly. You may have to ride the train. And if your social score is even lower, you may not be able to ride the train. You may have to ride the bus, or you may not be able to get a first class ticket. And so, or you may not be able to get a business loan, or your kids may not be able to go to school and, college, university. And so there are direct consequences. And so when you look at that and you say, okay, let's take that and bring it over here to the US, where we believe fundamentally, if you ask anybody, I've got this right to privacy, I've got a right to do certain things. Those rights are getting on the edge, because we really haven't fundamentally addressed whether you and me and I have a right to privacy. You have license plate readers, a good example. Well, okay, ostensibly they can determine whether you ran a red light and give you a ticket, but they can also determine where you were on any given day and at what time you were there. And so, as municipalities and cities and governments begin to collect those data sets, the question becomes, what are you doing with those data sets? Do I have the right to say, don't collect my data as to where I have driven, throughout the city on any given day? And how long are you holding that data? And, even now you have, because you could buy license plate readers anywhere, neighborhoods are starting to install them, and the interest is in neighborhoods. And so now private citizens are collecting that data, and saying, oh, well, this car was here this day. And so you have to ask yourself, Neil, where do we draw the line as a society? And how much are we willing to give up in terms of privacy for what is being called security? And where do you draw that line? And we haven't adequately addressed that legally, or just as a society. Kind of where do we want to be? And those are questions that you really need to get your hands around, because if you don't, you could go down a slippery slope into a society like China's, which I think is fundamentally different than what most Americans would perceive as the society they want to be in.
That's an amazing perspective, and I want to pull apart on just a couple of threads there, because you mentioned things like stingrays and license plate readers, and Palantir's been in the news frequently on and off for the last 10 or 15 years, right, for their use, for police forces' use of their technology to read license plates. But let's try to compartmentalize some of what you said just to
Okay.
one specific example, right? You talk about the perceived right to privacy, and I think if we look at the traditional house example that we always use in cybersecurity, right? You have a very specific demarcation for your sense of privacy in your house, right? If you're in your house, it's private. Even if you look at the computer systems in your house, that modem that's in your house is your demarcation point for your sense of privacy for your digital existence. But once you leave that house or leave that cable modem and go out into the internet, you've kind of lost that inherent right to privacy. With the world going mobile, and we specifically as we talk about stingrays, doesn't that right to privacy extend to your mobile device the same way, or not? Or is that not the same concept?
Well, in a way, in theory, it is the same concept, but there's theory and then there's reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so theory says, yes, you have a right of privacy in your house. Reality says that smart TV that you have in your house is collecting data on you in ways that you may not realize. And it's then, companies are taking that data, melding with other data and creating profiles of you, which then allow targeted advertising and things like that in ways that you may not realize. And advertising is one thing, but if I am now tracking exactly what you watch, and making suggestions on what you watch or reporting what you watch, so that at some later point you get a bad social score, could be problematic. But let's, I can go down that yellow brick road all day, because I in my core I'm a conspiracy theorist. so don't get me started on that. But to your point about the mobile phone, we have given up so much of our privacy for the convenience of carrying this thing in our hand. You can see it as a phone. I'll stop shaking it. But for carrying that around with us and that convenience. So what have we given up? We've given up, the companies can track who we call, when we call them, how long we talk to them. They can track where we are. They can track what we purchase. They can track if we're using, social media apps, what we're watching. All of those sorts of things are being collected by phones and phone apps. And we just, the vast majority of people, one, either don't realize it, or two, just don't care, and you often hear, well, if you aren't doing anything wrong, then what are you worried about? And that's fine until something happens. It's fine until it's not fine. And so these things, and this is a strong word, how these apps are utilized and the data they're collecting, I would argue that their usage is becoming more nefarious every day, because, people just don't realize. And, I'll ask you a question. When was now you may be an anomaly, but when was the last time when you updated that app, you read the privacy policy.
I'll be honest with that one. I don't think I've ever read the privacy
Right.
policy on an app.
No,
I think I've voluntarily have given up my right to privacy when it comes to this device. It's a
right.
risk acceptance decision I've done for myself that says there's nothing private about this device.
That's right. But what that means is that they could tell, Big Brother, companies, whoever, can tell where you are, where you've been, how long you were there,
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to start using other capabilities, who you are around, who you have associated with. And, we just, again, fundamentally haven't asked ourselves, is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, most people have just said, the convenience and the capability of being able to call somebody, being able to, watch a movie somewhere on this device or catch up with my sports team far outweighs any right of privacy I may have. But again, what I would argue is, it's okay until it's not okay. And then you start, if you get into a situation like China or some other community, societies where you can be actively tracked, and those associations that you have made come back to actively haunt you and impact you. And so, again, it's okay until it's not. And so that's what I would ask people to remember and to think about when you start talking about privacy. So my kids laugh at me because I have everything locked down, and and I try my best to be private. I don't have Facebook, or and nothing wrong with Facebook. It serves a purpose, but I don't have it, because I don't want to do that. My browsers are kind of locked down, so I can't, location services are off and all of that. But I would say I am in the 0.00001% of Americans, at least, that have that mentality. And most people don't. Most people don't really care. But it could be, all that, those data sets that are being collected. What are we doing with them? And data is becoming the new gold.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't really recognize the value of data, and being able to say, hey, Neil I know that on Tuesdays Neil goes to Starbucks and he buys a double caramel latte, espresso. And I'm people in the chat probably saying there's no such thing. I don't drink coffee, so I'm just making that up.
We've got a bunch of nerds that probably just drink black coffee. It's okay.
That's right. I drink black tea, unsweetened. But and there's some value associated with that. And then saying, okay, after that, Neil goes to the gym and he stays an hour in the gym and then he goes home. Well, now I know that I can send, if I'm Caribou or some competitor, well, let me send Neil a coupon, 30 minutes before he's going to buy coffee. And that coupon pops up. Well, he may just come to us. Same thing with the gym. Hey, free month, membership for a month, about an hour before you go into the gym. Great. Those data sets have value. Now, put your Orwellian hat on,
Mm-hmm.
and those data sets could be used for other purposes that you may not be okay with. We don't want Neil to go to the gym. And so when he starts that way, we're going to send him a text message that says, don't go to the gym. And, his smart car, we're going to shut his smart car down. There's so many things that can be done with these data sets that we just can't imagine right now. But when you start using artificial intelligence to really mine them, it could get scary pretty quickly. And we just don't have the legal protections in place to monitor and to put some fences around it, because we have not had those conversations, those honest conversations around it.
So thank you very much for that, Roy, because now you've just given me a reason to explain away why I don't go to the gym. I'm definitely being Orwellianly controlled by the government through my smartphone.
If you could see my body, you would say, okay, that's why he doesn't go. There you go.
I think picking on the Facebooks and the tracking and everything else like that, I think that's an easy target.
Yeah, that's too easy.
That's too easy. I think if we bring it back to facial recognition, if we bring it back to stingrays, and if we bring it back to companies like Palantir, obviously, they've existed with controversy prior to
Right.
the disaster that's been 2020.
Right.
But looking at just the cultural turmoil that we've been in over the last 6 months, and without getting political or anything else like
Right.
that, keeping it neutral, do you think that facial recognition et al, those other invasive technologies, do you think that the legal challenges have changed or accelerated in the last 6 months because of some of the cultural things that we've had to deal with?
I think the legal challenges have accelerated in the last 6 months because some of the things we have had to deal with. But also, I mean, we have kind of what I think is that perfect storm right now because you've got the COVID, you've got people working from home. We fundamentally changed how we work and think about work. And I don't know that we'll ever go back to what was normal. And so, but kind of getting back to your question directly, I think the legal challenges have been raised significantly, and I don't think that's a bad idea,
Mm.
a bad thing, because whether you're on the left or the right, the funny thing about it is, and this is not a political statement. If you look at most people on the far left and most people on the far right, from an ideological standpoint, there are a lot of similar agreements.
Mm-hmm.
Government doesn't have a right to intrude. I have a right to privacy. I shouldn't be tracked. You shouldn't be using these technologies, those sorts of things. And that's the irony of it, quite frankly, is that a lot of those concepts kind of transcend the political spectrum. But I think it's a good thing for us to have the conversations, for these issues to be put into the courts, put into the legal system, put into the legislative system, so that the questions are being asked, and hopefully we can come up with answers that we as a society are comfortable with. Because the biggest danger is not asking the questions and letting the technology run amok, and then you have essentially the tail wagging the dog.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You have the technology determining how society functions instead of society determining how technology functions.
That's a good point. Let's head over to chat because I did get a little behind on questions here. Just that was pretty intriguing to get into. So Edward Malice says, question for Roy. Do you know what steps, if any, have been taken to ensure maturity in cybersecurity-based legislation so that it keeps up with the technology and industry practices? From working in the public sector a bit, I get the feeling not many is the answer.
Okay, so I think he's right. I think that it was a he, but I think they're right. But that said, we are trying. So one of the things that I failed to mention, I'm on the policy board for the National NTSC, National Technology Security Coalition, which is a trade organization of CISOs nationwide from corporate America. And their goal is to help influence policy, to help educate legislators, especially on a federal level, around these technologies. And probably the biggest issue is awareness. And as just being candid about it, we have most politicians, not most, a large number of politicians are career politicians. I would say most politicians had never been in in the technology fields, and let alone cybersecurity, and so aren't going to have a fundamental understanding of the threats that are out there, a fundamental understanding of the technologies that can help kind of mitigate those threats, and so aren't going to have a fundamental understanding of what you need to do to legislate to help in the cybersecurity or technology areas. And so, the first thing you have to do is try to educate the legislators to say, okay, here are the threats that are out there. And that's difficult because the threats are ever evolving. And I would argue that, it's definitely not a Moore's law type situation, but they're going to get exponentially bigger and bigger and stronger and faster because of AI and other things. And so those threats are constantly morphing. And when you start trying to legislate, then you're trying to not only deal with what's here and now, but legislate in a manner that then deals and anticipates future threats. And that's very difficult to do, on a consistent basis, especially if you're not aware of cybersecurity or technology on a deep level. I mean, I would argue that most of the people on this call who are in the technology area or the cybersecurity area spend a whole lot of time on things like this and reading and learning just to keep up with the threats that are out there. And so when you start talking about a legislator that is trying to do something, it becomes more difficult because they've got to deal with healthcare, they've got to deal with cybersecurity, they've got to deal with elections, they've got to deal with the postal service. There's so many things they have to deal with. Now, all that said, that's still no excuse because it's something we have to deal with. As a society. And so, legislators do need to put the time in because probably the biggest existential threat to America and to, governments all over the world and societies is going to be cyber, is going to be how do you keep all this technology that we're using, all this technology that we're developing, how do you keep it secure, so that it is used for the intended purpose, assuming the intended purpose is good and not a bad or nefarious purpose. And that's a difficult undertaking on the best of days.
Now we have seen legislation around cyber. I think just literally last week, I think
Right.
there was a Senate resolution passed to impose some cybersecurity regulations around some Internet of Things devices that go to protect
Right.
Right. Critical infrastructure. I think what always comes into play, and I think we asked General Williams this a couple weeks ago when he was on the show. The hard part about legislation, right, is that fine balance that you get between to your point, government oversight versus allowing a company to make their own fiscal decisions when it comes to their P&L and their shareholders.
Right.
So what is that balance, or what do you think that balance looks like between legislation and capitalism?
Right. So I am a free market person, right? And I'll start by saying that. However, if a society is going to function, there has to be some guardrails. There have to be guidelines, and I think is the purpose of legislation. In my mind, is to establish those guardrails to keep the car from going off the road. Now, you can meander all over the roads you want to, but we've got to keep the car from going off the road because that's when we have catastrophic results. And so I think that balance is, again, using that analogy, government should try to put the guardrails up. Now, how you drive the car, how you make the car perform, all that's capitalism. That's what you do. But we have to keep the car on the road. And so, there is a fine balance, but a good example is CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification that I talked about earlier. And what that is for, those that are listening that don't know, it is an attempt by the Department of Defense, and I'm not going to get into the particulars of it, but it's an attempt by the Department of Defense to say for anybody in the Defense Department supply chain, contractors, suppliers, primes, subs, you have to meet certain cybersecurity standards, and they have levels 1 through 5, 1 being general cyber hygiene, 5 being, super secure, 3 being roughly the equivalent of NIST 800-171. But that's an attempt by the DoD to say you've got, from a national security standpoint, we've got to put some standards around cybersecurity for everybody in the supply chain. And because of that, hopefully the whole defense supply chain, national security will be more secure. However, CMMC is going through some pains because now you're bringing, these standards to this industry, and they have to get a independent third party assessor to come in and certify that they've met those standards. And the interesting thing, and don't quote me on this number because I've read different ones, but I've read, in the past before CMMC under DFARS, which was the Defense Department's version of cybersecurity, regulations, the companies had to self-certify. And I read that, 30 to 43%, again, I've seen various range, but less than half of the companies that self-certified that they met certain standards actually met those standards. Yeah. And when you think about that, that's a scary statistic, especially given the industry that we're talking about. Now, I would argue that if you get outside of the DoD and that supply chain, it's probably even less than that. So, there's a lot of room for corporate America to do better with respect, to drive that car a little bit straighter themselves. But again, I think it's the role of government to put those guardrails up just to make sure you don't have a catastrophic result.
All right, so I'm going to poke at your guardrails. So there was a lot of chat that was going on, in between this conversation, right, that pertain to, GDPR and CCPA. And you and I talked about this kind of in our pre-interview before you come on the show. Would you not agree that GDPR for the EU and CCPA for California, and then I think what Maine and some of the other states are trying to do, those are those guardrails that are putting in place? And if you do agree with that, then why do we continue to allow the systems to trivialize the legal penalties, especially in the case of GDPR, when it's there to help protect consumers?
Right. So, and just to make sure that we are, talking about apples and talking about oranges. So GDPR, CCPA are going to be more privacy focused as opposed to cyber security focused.
But it's an attempt at regulation to try to bring.
It's an attempt at regulation. So let's talk about CCPA first, the California Consumer Privacy Act, which basically is, I call it a mini GDPR light, which basically gives consumers rights around how their information is used and collected and those sorts of things. The problem with CCPA, it's a great try, but it's California. There are 50 states. And so here in the United States, where we fall down, in my opinion, is we don't have a national version of CCPA, right? And so what's going to happen is California is going to have CCPA, Georgia is going to have GCPA, South Carolina is going to have SCCPA, Oregon is going to have OCPA, and now you're going to have 50 different versions of privacy legislation in the United States. And as we've seen with data breach notification laws, which there are 50 different versions of it, for businesses, it becomes onerous to comply, because now you've got to try to figure out where a consumer is, what state they reside in, what laws apply in terms of how you treat that consumer, or you try to find a common standard denominator amongst all 50, and it just becomes a compliance burden. And so I would argue that unless and until we get some national, a US CCPA version that applies across the board, we're going to struggle, because there are always going to be companies that either intentionally or unintentionally just can't comply because the compliance burden is too great to try to figure out 50 different states' laws. And I see companies struggle with it all the time, because that's kind of the business I'm in too. You see these companies that want to do the right thing, but struggle with doing the right thing because they can't figure out what it is legislatively. So, from the US standpoint, again, I would say unless and until we get some kind of national consumer privacy legislation and laws in place, we're going to struggle, and those privacy rights of consumers are going to fall between the cracks. GDPR, the European Union, they struggle. It's interesting because Privacy Shield was just invalidated, which deals with transfers of information. And it was interesting. I met Max Schremm, who was the original guy that brought the lawsuit because of his Facebook data. that led to all of this consumer privacy stuff in Europe. And I asked him, we were on a panel together up in New York many years ago, and I asked him offline. I said, well, wow, you planned all this? This is great. He said, no, I was just mad because they were using my data, and weren't getting my permission to use it. And so it was just interesting because he didn't plan, this grand thing. He was just pissed off, excuse the French, because they were using his data without his permission, and or selling it. And so, uh, you know, so you had that the original shrimps, which then led to Privacy Shield, which was just invalidated. Now, you have to go back to the standard contractual clauses, and I know I'm getting in the weeds legally, but the point being, even the EU, which is at the forefront, I would argue, globally, of trying to protect consumers and privacy rights, and give consumers some say so over how their information is used. Even they are struggling because this fundamental right of privacy is a difficult one to identify first and administer second. So we have legislation, and trust me, I'm by no means belittling those efforts. I think they are valiant efforts. I think they're greatly needed efforts, but they just run into trouble because here in the U.S. you've got to have federal legislation, and if you don't, it's going to be problematic from a compliance standpoint, and it's going to be problematic from just trying to identify what those fundamental rights are, because every state's going to have different fundamental rights, and that becomes a problem.
That makes sense. Head back over to chat for a couple questions. Afras says, does every business in different industries look at cybersecurity policies and procedures regarding data breaches differently?
All right, run that question by me one more time.
Does every business in different industries look at cybersecurity policies and procedures regarding data breaches differently?
Yes and no. So the yes is because different industries are regulated differently. So the financial industry, for example, is going to have different regulations than, say, the healthcare industry. Healthcare has HIPAA, high tech, and there are certain requirements around notifications and data breaches and what is a breach. And then you get into other industries, say a fast food restaurant, where their credit card information is breached. They're going to approach that differently. So to a large part, it just depends upon what industry it is and what information is actually breached. And that's one of the things that we go through whenever we have someone that has a data breach and we're trying to help is, okay, what industry are you in, first off? And that's going to determine what laws and rules and regulations, HIPAA, high tech, Graham Leach, Wiley, what really applies to your industry in terms of notifications and what is a breach. In some instances, if the information is encrypted, then it's not deemed to be a breach. Some, you have to say, okay, is there evidence of use of it? If not, then it maybe not be a breach. So there are always steps that you have to go through, depending first on the industry, then on what kind of data was taken, depending upon what state that data was in. Was it encrypted? Was it not? But you would be surprised that how many industries really don't deal with data breaches very well. And as consumers, I mean, if you think about the first time you got one of those letters that said your data was breached, and you get
credit monitoring
for 6 months or a year, and you're outraged. Oh my goodness, what should I do? Or, is my identity going to be stolen? Blah, blah, blah. By the time you get the 150th of those letters, you don't even read it. You throw it away. Right? You open it up, we inform you, okay, well, I already had credit monitoring, nothing happened last time, and you just chunk it. And in some ways, we've just become numb to these transgressions. And it used to be that, you would think about holding the business accountable. I'm not going to shop there anymore.
Right.
Now, you don't, most people, I would argue the vast majority of consumers don't really worry about it, don't really punish businesses. And so that market force of punishment, i.e., people won't shop at your business anymore, I would argue is pretty much gone. And so really the only protections are, kind of circling back to the regulatory side will be those laws that are put in place with respect to data breaches, protection of consumers' information, protection of healthcare information. I mean, you get somebody's healthcare information, their insurance or their, you've got gold. That's
Yep.
on the black market. That's gold. That's data gold.
We've talked a lot on the show about the desensitization of consumers being the number one cause why we can't
Right.
hold businesses accountable anymore, to your
Right.
point, like we used to.
Yes. And so that's right. I mean, again, when you have heard for the 100th time, and I'm not really exaggerating there, that a company you've dealt with has had a data breach of some sort. But and your life goes on for the most part. And then some people do have issues, and some people do have identities stolen, and that's a tough thing to come back from. I'm not minimizing that at all. But for the vast majority of people, nothing happens. And so people just, they don't care. And so, when Target had its issue, the CEO got fired, but you hadn't heard that much anymore. You don't hear that much anymore that, the CEO gets fired.
Well, not only that, but
because,
as a matter of fact, their profits only dipped that first quarter after the breach. I think
right.
now they've got record earnings and everything quarter over quarter
Right.
since then.
That's right. And now, with the whole COVID and lockdown and online ordering and all of that, I mean, they're right up there, doing extremely well, profit wise. And so there's no blowback from it. Home Depot, had that issue. They're doing very well right now.
Anthem's doing really well.
Anthem's doing very well. So, from a consumer standpoint, we just don't, hold companies accountable. And so, unless you have that legislation and, legislative guardrails in place, then, there is no accountability for it. And then that's going to be problematic.
On that same vein, Afras has a follow-up one, right? He says that's kind of what, how he thought it was. The question he asks is, do you think they will make a law that makes breaches required to be documented, not just investigated?
So, eventually we might get there. So the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, now requires publicly traded companies to publicly disclose breaches, right? And that's, relatively new. And at least that's a step in that direction to say, okay, you've got to disclose the breach, which means you've got to tell what happened, how, potentially how it happened. But even then, there's a line that has to be walked, because let's just say here in Georgia, for example, the state of Georgia has a law that says for municipalities, at least, if you have a data breach or some kind of attack, you don't have to disclose it under public information, Public Records Acts or sunshine laws, if it compromises potentially the security posture of the municipality. Mm-hmm. So, and I get that. I mean, that's a very useful thing, because, I don't want to say, I had a ransomware attack that, because my network segmentation wasn't correct, or something that then gives the bad guys, oh, I know how to get them now, because there's no way in a week they have stood up, the proper Active Directory or whatever it may be. And, so I know how to get them. So you can't give the keys to the kingdom. So, there is that fine line between requiring public disclosure of it and, trying to keep the security posture or the fact that there is no security posture of a company or a public institution private so that they can fix the problem and not have multiple attacks. And you
Well,
know,
hold on,
that
hold on, hold on.
guys,
But before you dive into the next one, I want to pick at that a little bit though, if you don't mind though, because
yeah,
Garmin's a good example of this, right?
okay,
Because
yeah,
you know they had to pay a ransom to get a decryption key to an
mhm,
organization that was on the OFAC list,
right.
but it's not going to be reported in their 10K how much ransom they paid. Like are companies cheating those laws to hide around whether they have to report those types of disclosures? I mean, where does a company like Garmin think that it doesn't have to be accountable to its shareholders for their ransomware attack?
Well, because it is a value, you know, it's a business decision for them. So if I can pay $500,000 and get the keys and decrypt all our data, or if it's going to cost me, you know, maybe I don't have good backups or proper backups, and it's going to cost me, you know, $30 million to recreate that data, or you know, in the case of somebody like an Equifax, and I'm not saying this is what happened, but just in general, you know, kind of as an example, in a case like Equifax, let's just say the ransomware attacker said, okay, you pay us $1 million, or we're going to release all of those credit files, you know, 1 million credit files on the dark net. Well, what's the best course of action? Is it to pay the $1 million or have that 1 million credit files released? It's probably, and most shareholders would probably say it's better to pay the $1 million. And so when you start talking about accountability to a shareholder, that's a different equation, I would say, fundamentally, than accountability to, you know, society in general.
Hmm.
Because again, shareholder maximize profit.
Mm-hmm.
What's going to maximize profit? Pay that $1 million, or have the essence of our business, the core of our business released?
Yeah.
Um, is to pay the $1 million, right? And so, you know, that's just in my mind, a more fundamental business decision than it is, you know, kind of a right versus wrong decision. And I think most businesses are going to adopt that mentality to the end of the day.
Good perspective. So Viper 7 says, I'm still not really sure why unauthorized release of data provided under contract wouldn't carry stiff financial damages for each offense. If companies were liable for $10,000, I had to count the zeros there, for every email address they leaked in a breach, you'd see much more careful stepping.
True, you know, but again, and let me just say, true. If you could do that, if you had the teeth to do it, if you had legislation to do it, but you know what a small to mid-sized business is going to say is, look, you know, I'm barely making it, but I have 100 employees here. I'm barely making it. I don't have the ability to spend $1 million to get to a level of cybersecurity roughly equivalent to NIST 800-171. I just don't have the money. Now, if I have a data breach and I get fined $10,000 for every record that's released, and you know, all of a sudden now I've got to pay $1 million, I very well might shut down. 100 people here in Central Ohio are going to be out of work. No right-minded legislator is going to say, okay, yeah, we're going to put you out of work. You know, we're going to put these people out of work in order to prevent this cyber breach. Now, am I saying that we ought to be, you know, mindful of cybersecurity? Absolutely, absolutely. But there's always that you know, balance that you have to try to strike of trying to get to the best place you can that makes economical sense. So, you know, and we see that right now with CMMC, because there are a lot of small to mid-sized businesses that very well might be required to get the level 3 certification, which probably a cost, depending on where you start from,
Mm-hmm.
anywhere from $75,000 to $150,000. There are a lot of small businesses that just don't have that.
Yeah.
They just don't, right? And so the question becomes, what do you do with them to get them to a better cybersecurity posture, balanced against, keeping the doors open and keeping them afloat. And so there's always that balance there. So the short answer is yes. In a perfect world, if you could levy big fines on companies that had breaches and things like that, you absolutely would see far fewer breaches, but you would also see far fewer companies out there because a lot of companies just don't have that money.
Therson follows up with that about, it says, now I'm wondering if they wouldn't just fudge the numbers and say that only 1,000 records were stolen instead of the real number to avoid the fine.
Right.
I don't think that that's any different than any of the other corruption that corporations pull to try to avoid regulatory issues right now.
Yeah. And you see that in breaches all the time. One of the things you always try to figure out is, what happened and do you have to report it? And, were, 10,000, compromised, or was it just 1,000? So you see that kind of equation and that thought matrix going on all the time. That said, though, I just want to make sure that people don't think that I've got the lawyer hat and I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here.
No, this is why we had a lawyer on there. We want to hear all these trade secrets.
Try to make you think of, try to make everybody think about these things, because in my world, I'm a cybersecurity guy, legally, operationally, procedurally. And so I want to see the highest level of cybersecurity in all companies across the board, and all municipalities and governments across the board. I am a huge believer in cybersecurity because, technology runs our world. It's not next week, it's here and now. It runs our world. And unless we can keep that technology secure, we are going to have problems now, tomorrow, a week from now. So I absolutely want to see cybersecurity front and center. It's just that there are always competing interests when you start talking about absolutes. And I think that's where we kind of can get sidetracked a little bit as a society, because we're dealing with those competing interests on cybersecurity and even privacy to some extent.
So that's a good perspective. I think with that, I want to kind of move on to our next topic. That was a really good session in there. And again, remember, guys, keep chat flowing with any questions that you've got. We'll continue to do those throughout. We talked a little bit about this on Monday, Roy, and I told the viewers that we would bring this back up with you here because I wanted to ask you some very specific questions about this. But just to recap from Monday's conversation, right? We talked about how there was a ransomware attack that happened in a hospital in Germany. The attack started last Thursday and affected about 30 of the hospital servers, basically encrypting them with ransomware. And what had happened was that the police had communicated with the attackers and told them that the ransomware had actually hit an emergency hospital and not the university, which was allegedly their intended target.
Right.
And then after that, the attackers had withdrawn the ransom and provided the decryption key. But obviously they vanished and the police haven't had any contact since then. And then we later learned that a patient who was in transit from that particular hospital to a very distant hospital because of a medical condition had died en route.
Wow.
Okay. And I know that there's a lot to unpack here, and I know that this happened in Germany, but if this had happened in the U.S. versus Germany, how would the response have been different? Can you kind of walk through legally like what would have been different if this had happened maybe in the U.S. versus Germany?
Right. Lawsuits would fly. We in the U.S. are a litigious society. And, bottom line, we're a litigious society. And, and it's funny, I'm putting my defensive shield on right now because people blame lawyers now for that. And, and that's fine. I'm not that kind of lawyer. I would be in trouble if you call me. I always tell my friends, if you get in trouble and you have a quarter, you can call me, but I just have to find somebody else to come get you out.
No, I brought you on here so that the guests know who to call.
That's right.
When they did get in trouble.
All I'll say is I hope you have 2 quarters, right? Because if you use one on me, you probably need another one. But we just are a litigious society, and you get the jury awards and all of that. And so you would see a lawsuit over that.
But who
You
would
know,
get sued?
from the patient's family, probably to the hospital, to say, hey, you didn't have proper cybersecurity protocols in
Mm,
place. And because of that, you know, you didn't have proper protocols in place to prevent it. And you clearly didn't have proper protocols and procedures in place to respond to it. Right. And so, you know, then you start saying, what was your incident response plan? Let me see it. You know, what was, you know, your plan for a critically ill patient on a ventilator if the ventilators go down, you know, kind of what did you do to prepare for this, and you see that. And so I think the hospital would be held accountable, at least in the lawsuit, from a lawsuit
would the
perspective.
hospital still be held accountable if it had been a lightning strike or a natural disaster or a generator had failed or some other type of non-cyber event? Same thing would have
You know,
happened.
potentially, I mean, because, you know, from a hospital standpoint, again, anybody listening, don't take this as
The
any
standard lawyer answer right here.
any kind of legal advice. You know, consult your own legal professional for your direct answers. But that said, you know, you have to, you know, was it foreseeable, right? So if you're a hospital on the Gulf Coast, is it foreseeable that a hurricane may come and knock the power out?
Hmm.
Probably, you know. Is it foreseeable in Atlanta that a hurricane's going to knock the power out? Probably not, right? And so you have to say, okay, is it foreseeable that something could happen? And if it could, then you need to take proper steps to have a plan B, and maybe even a plan C. So if you're in a low-lying hospital, in a flood zone, in a hurricane zone, right on the coast, well, you know, you need to have an evacuation protocol to evacuate patients to get them to higher ground. You know, that should be part of your incident preparedness.
Hmm.
And you know, and if you didn't, then potentially you are accountable. And if you're a hospital and you're relying on technology to keep people alive, then you have to understand what you need to do should that technology fail, right? And if you don't have a plan in place, then okay, you may be held accountable. You know,
So the potential argument would look like you should have known because you have computers that ransomware was a potential threat, and
right,
therefore you took inadequate protections to protect yourself from that threat.
right. Adequate backups, adequate, you know, emergency procedures, adequate network segmentation, adequate Active Directory, adequate two-factor authentication. You know, all of those things that you put in place to keep systems up and running and secure, and you know, against attacks, whether it's ransomware or phishing, you know, not phishing, but ransomware or denial of service or anything like that, then yeah, you know, potentially you are going to be held accountable should something happen that you knew or should have known what's going to happen. And so you know, it is not far fetched for me to imagine that, you know, that scenario. You know, but now again, different states have different laws. So some states it might work and some it might not. Um,
I,
but
I
I
was
think I think it that underscores so why it's important for industries, you know, particular industries in I'm using the word particular a lot, in certain industries in particular, to have adequate plans around cyber incidents, cyber attacks, ransomware attacks, and those sorts of things, so that you are more resilient on the front end. And then, should something happen, you're in a position to limit the damage, and then you're in a better position to respond and recover from whatever kind of attack that is. You know,
so on that real quick though, because like I was talking with a senior executive at VMware the other day, and we were chatting about this,
right,
and he was saying, and I kind of want to get your perspective on this, is he was saying that he was surprised we haven't seen this sooner. Do you agree or disagree with that? Or you think that's a little too cynical?
When you say seeing what sooner?
Seeing a patient dying from a ransomware attack due to a hospital.
Um, whether they die or not, I'm surprised we haven't seen more impact or heard about more impact from ransomware attacks or other types of cyber attacks. There are other attacks that can be just as impactful as a ransomware attack in terms of service. If you do a denial of service and all of a sudden, equipment can't communicate with other equipment, or you can't communicate, a hospital monitor can't communicate with the mainframe that has the information on what that monitor ought to be doing, that can be just as impactful as a ransomware attack. So maybe surprise is not the right word, but and it may be happening. We may just not have heard about it. That's the other thing you have to remember.
Mm-hmm.
Just because you haven't heard about something doesn't mean it's not happening.
Now they're in Germany. They're looking to charge these guys, as you can see right here, with negligent manslaughter. Do you think that in the U.S. there'd be grounds for some form of manslaughter or some form of legal action against the individuals conducting the ransomware attack?
Yeah, if you could get to them, yeah, absolutely. And that's always the $1 million question, literally and figuratively.
Right.
Whether you can get to them. Most ransomware attacks that I am familiar with are perpetrated out of countries that you can't get to them. I've seen attacks where, law enforcement is able to determine exactly who did it, right? The name of the person that did it, but they can't get to them because they're in a country, like Iran or North Korea or somewhere like that, certain Eastern European countries where they can't physically get to them. And, so there's nothing they can do. Now, if they could, absolutely, they would be charged. Absolutely, they would. In that case, negligent homicide, murder, depending upon what the state law would be. But I have no doubt that they would be charged, and sometimes maybe even charged in absentia.
What's that? I don't think I know what that is.
That means we can't bring you over here to stand trial, so we're going to put you on trial anyway, even though you're absent and you're over there.
But they do that a lot with like a lot of the Chinese nationals that they've done here recently.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so you see that, and then that puts you on the Interpol watch list. And should you ever leave North Korea or Iran, we'll get you. So absolutely, I think that, can happen. But again, I think it just underscores why, a good cybersecurity posture is so critically important, because it can be life and death. And I think, as we get, more technologically advanced, and I'm using that phrase very loosely, and when we get self-driving cars and, traffic lights that, govern based on the speeds and traffic flows, and we just get more advanced, you have a cyber attack on those, and it doesn't have to be a ransomware attack, but you have a cyber attack on those, you could cause a lot of damage. And so again, it just underscores why we have to look at this thing, more critically, and why it's important for those guardrails to be up.
So important question from Edward in chat, specifically to your point about, charging folks, who are outside the country. He says, isn't that unconstitutional? I'm sure there's an amendment that says you have the right to present your defense and face your accusers.
You absolutely do. In the city, when the city of Atlanta had its ransomware attack, we worked with the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney here in Atlanta, and they did a fabulous job for us. And 2 Iranian nationals were charged, and they were publicly named and disclosed, and had every right to come over and face their accuser. So it's not necessarily unconstitutional. They have the right to come here. Now, whether they would, I mean, come
So,
on.
so the constitutional right extends to them that they could come here and face their accusers and present their case, but they choose necessarily not to because they know they're going to be arrested and thrown in jail more
Right.
likely.
If I were them, I wouldn't. I
Yeah.
mean, that's just speaking, honestly. Uh, if I've got $5 million in the bank and I'm free, why would I come and risk losing that 5 million and being put in jail? So, now that starts getting into kind of some murky questions around. And admittedly, my answer was a very simplistic answer. Very
Safe
simplistic.
answer.
Yeah, safe answer and a simplistic answer, because you start getting into the issues around whether foreign nationals have constitutional rights, and you get into the whole Guantanamo thing, which we are just not going to
Right.
get
Let's not do that
yeah,
here.
we're not going there. But so that's why I say mine is a simplistic answer, but probably a realistic answer if from the mindset of somebody over there. They would not come here to face those charges.
Sure.
I wouldn't.
Fair enough. Let's hit another slightly controversial topic. Kind of talking around this idea of mass hacking and whatnot. So we've talked about this on the stream a couple of different times. We talked about EncroChat, and I've talked about this on my podcast with Insecurity, right? And just to re-level set everybody on the background, right, is there was a provider. It was a company called EncroChat that produced encrypted Android devices and was selling them to a multitude of people. They also happened to be selling them to criminals.
Right.
It's no different than a gun seller selling guns to law-abiding citizens and non-law-abiding citizens, right? A couple months ago, there was a massive takedown of several of these criminals, and it happened in France. It was touted as the largest law enforcement hacking that had ever been conducted. Some new information has emerged about how the National Crime Agency over in Europe had gained access to those devices, and of note, they'd said that it was an 18-month operation. The servers were hosted in France, which is what gave them kind of their jurisdictional authority to conduct the hacking operation that they had done. And they had actually loaded malware onto these devices,
Right.
where they had gotten geolocation, chat messages, passwords, Wi-Fi access points that were near the device. And then law enforcement used the MAC addresses and the SSIDs of those Wi-Fi access points to try to triangulate and locate down some of these criminals. I say all that to say, like, it's obviously a large, massive organization. You see those types of takedowns when we talk about some of the, the more nefarious darknet markets that exist out there on the Tor network or the pedophile rings that have been brought down. But EncroChat was a company and it was a legitimate business that was offering these custom-built phones and selling them for there were celebrities that bought these phones. And so I guess, from your perspective, could law enforcement in the U.S. go after some type of mass hacking operation on an entire business like this legally?
Right. Okay, could they or do they?
Let's not talk about do they.
Let me ask, what was the question there, Neil?
Could they?
Could they or do they? Okay, could they? Okay, all right. So I just wanted to level set the question.
Yeah.
All right, so could they? Legally, in theory, well, yes. You get a FISA warrant, and if you can convince a FISA judge, that criminality is happening and you can get a warrant, then yeah, absolutely you can. And that's the I think the short, simple answer to that question. But then you get into, okay, what if I'm doing nothing wrong? Then presumably you lost your money on the phone, right? You don't get arrested, you don't get indicted, you just lost your money on the phone if you're a celebrity and you just bought it so you could be more secure. What I tell people, and this is not promoting criminality in any way, right, is that from a privacy standpoint and security standpoint, if it's based on technology, it can be hacked, right? Bottom line, very few things are unhackable, very few things are impenetrable. And so you just have to take that mindset in everything you do online, via mobile device, via computer, whatever it may be, because devices can be hacked. You've got a lot of smart people out there, both on the good side and on the bad side. And and that's their job, is to find ways around it. So absolutely, it can be hacked legally. Yes, if you get a FISA warrant, other kinds of warrants, that you can kind of show that there's a presumption of criminality happening, because otherwise, from a legal jurisprudence standpoint, how can you take down the pedophile rings? How can you take down the drug smuggling, the people that really are doing illegal or bad things? You have to have some mechanism, and there are mechanisms to do it here in the United States.
I guess I look at this though, and when you read through this, and again, we don't know exactly what happened over there and all the details of the legal documents because it hasn't been released yet, but it reads like a massive dragnet operation, right? Where they went to these servers, these IncroChat servers, and they deployed malware to every customer inside the IncroChat network. And so I'm not necessarily arguing the validity of whether it could be hacked from a technological perspective. But that seems very anti to some of the dragnet laws that we have here that say, like, I'm just gonna roll up to Google and push, a piece of malware out to every phone on the Android store.
Yeah. In theory, you would hope that legally here in the U.S. that malware push would be more targeted, right? So that they went in front of a judge and said, hey, look, and FISA, is terrorism and other stuff, but went in front of that judge and said, hey, look, this person and this person and this person we believe are doing some illegal activities. Here's the proof we have thus far. We need a warrant to push the malware to this phone, and this phone. And so you would hope that here in the US, there wouldn't be the cause to just push it carte blanche to everybody and start intercepting the private communications of people that presumably they have no basis for believing that they are doing anything illegal with this, other than trying to keep their information private and secure, which again I think is a fundamental constitutional right against illegal search and seizure here in the United States. So if I have one of these phones and I just bought it purely to have more private communications because I'm a celebrity or a politician, then I would argue that you have a fundamental constitutional, I think it's a Fourth Amendment right to, against illegal search and seizure. And I would argue that putting malware on my phone with no basis for doing it would constitute an illegal search and seizure.
Do you think that argument would hold up if it was determined that IncroChat as a company was 75% criminal activity due to the investigation that the law enforcement was doing or Department of Justice was doing, and only 25% was maybe for celebrities and politicians? Do you think that type of argument would stand up to some type of dragnet operation like this?
Well, there are two things. So one is whether that innocent buyer has a right to privacy, and against illegal search and seizure. So I would argue that even if the enterprise as a whole was, bad, and when I say bad, they knew that they were being used for, nefarious and illegal purposes, that even then, a person that is using it for innocent purposes, perfectly legal purposes, ought to have that right, against illegal search and seizure. And you can take down the enterprise without necessarily taking down the privacy rights of that innocent individual. You could go in and shut it down. You could shut in whatever it's called, InfoChat down.
IncroChat, yeah.
IncroChat down, and not infringe upon the rights of those innocent users. Because there's nothing that says you have to look at everybody's communications to determine that as a whole this enterprise is corrupt and knows that it's being used for illegal and nefarious purposes.
That's fair. So it looks like you have a fellow conspiracy theorist inside a chat.
I love it. I love it.
Muncher says, you mentioned the Fourth Amendment, and I saw this comment come up, right? The carriers sell them this data anyway to skirt the Fourth Amendment. Do you think that, I think he's referring to the PRISM program that
Right.
Snowden released.
Right.
Do you think that carriers skirt the Fourth Amendment and sell this data out?
I think I would argue almost that. So you could buy, right, this data. And so if the feds want it, they just go buy it, right? I mean, because the carriers do provide this data. And who buys the data? You know, all of us, a lot of different companies, data management companies, data aggregation companies buy it. Because again, what people don't realize is these data sets that are created. If you get the carrier data, you get credit card data, you get, you know, location data, and you start pulling all this together. Now you've got some really good profiles on people that can track that behavior. And so, you know, again, not getting political, but when you had the Facebook Cambridge
Mm-hmm.
Analytica thing, they were able to, based on data sets that they were getting and aggregating, target people, not, you know, your community, not your neighborhood, not your street. They were able to target you, you know, and they were able to say, Neil loves guns, the Second Amendment. And so we are going to target an ad that says his Second Amendment rights are under fire. His neighbor. The economy is the big deal for her because she just lost her job and she needs a job and she wants a strong economy. So the ad we're going to send her is going to be based on the economy. Next door is somebody, you know, that has a strong religious belief and they are anti-abortion. We're going to target them. And so these data sets that are out there for sale, feds can buy them too. Governments can buy them too. And utilize that. And you can easily get around, you know, kind of this search and seizure because we're not seizing it. We're buying it.
We're buying it. So
Right.
it's interesting that you bring that up because I did attend a Black Hat talk last year, that was very much centered around like T-Mobile, Sprint, and Verizon's programs that they had for
Right.
selling to brokers, and then those brokers would then sell that access to your point, to other entities that were interested in it from consumer targeting and data analytics perspective. And there was very little regulation when it went downstream from those brokers
Right.
as to who could actually purchase that data.
Some would say very little or none.
Yeah.
You know, as to who could purchase that data. And so, you know, kind of the question becomes, what are they doing with that data? And that's what I think there needs to be some guardrails around. You know, I go back to that guardrail analogy. You know, yeah, let the car wander according to how corporate America wants to do it, but there needs to be guardrails around how you can use that data. Because, you know, again, not getting into a political statement here, but, you know, healthcare. So, you know, if pre-existing conditions aren't automatically covered, you know, where you have government regulation that says pre-existing conditions are covered. Well, now from a data set standpoint, if I know that you went to a clinic and you got tested for COVID and you tested positive, and now it comes out that I'm making this up.
Sure.
You know, and it comes out that, you know, heart conditions are, you know, a latent effect of COVID. You know, 6 months from now, 80% of the people that have COVID will have heart murmurs, right? And now that data set is aggregated that you went to the cardiologist, you went and got some medicine for it, you tested positive, and now there are no exclusions on not covering pre-existing conditions. If I'm a healthcare company, do I want those data sets? Absolutely, I do, because I may pay $2 for that data set on you, you know, to figure out what a pre-existing condition or what conditions you may have. But in the long run, I may save myself hundreds of thousands of dollars because I won't cover you, and now I don't have to pay for open heart surgery 5 years from now. for you. You know, and it's all because you went and got tested for COVID.
Yeah. It
And
gets back to that data conversation we were having at the beginning of the
right,
night, right? Whereas, you know, data's all well and good, but how are they using that data, and what's,
that's
I think
right,
I saw somebody in chat, you know, bring it up, say like, what's their definition of right or wrong when it comes to how
right.
they use that data?
That's right. You know, and I think we as a society just have not had those conversations. You know, our conversation, you know, rightly or wrongly, you know, so I'm not making any judgment on it. You know, we talk about pre-existing conditions, but what we don't talk about is how data may be mined and utilized to, in the first place, determine whether you have a pre-existing condition or not.
Yeah.
You know, and so while you may be arguing to your healthcare provider, I'm perfectly healthy, and then they use a data set, you know, when you then go in and you've been paying your premiums and you go in for open heart surgery, and they use a data set to say, hey, look, you know, you actually had COVID, and, you know, this heart condition stuff is a direct byproduct of that. So we're going to deny your surgery. We're not going to pay for it because
This
you had a pre-existing condition that you didn't disclose, you know, on your application. And so there, and again, I'm just making that
Yeah,
up,
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think you
but,
bring up a valid point in terms of
you know,
just like, this is how, because we're complacent as consumers with what
right,
companies are doing with our data, and then who they're selling it to, and how they're using it downstream.
right.
This is some of the long potential hypothetical long-term negative impacts that complacency and ignorance on us as consumers could have.
That's right. That's right. You know, and corporate America does you know, they try to, especially now, say this is how we're going to use your data. Um, but you know, a lot of times that doesn't say how, whether we're going to sell your data or not. You know, this is how we may use it, but we may sell it, somebody else uses it however they wish, you know. And once it gets out of their hands, the collector's hands, then that privacy policy arguably may not be valid anymore, may not have any you know, kind of say so over your data or how it's used. And so again, like you said, our ignorance and complacency as consumers a lot of times might have negative impacts on us down the road that we don't envision.
That's fair.
You know, and another good example of that is automobile companies, you know, insurance companies. And, you know, those insurance companies will say, hey, if you install this little device on your car and you drive safely, we will give you a discount. And
Yeah,
you say,
yeah.
okay,
The
well,
progressive guys were good for that, weren't they?
right, right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I say I wasn't gonna call any names,
Oh,
but you know,
we totally call names out on this show.
right,
It's what we
right,
do.
right. You know, and so in theory, you know, it's being sold as X. You know, if you drive safely, you get a discount. But what if you? What they don't say is if you don't drive safely, we may drop you, or we may raise your rates. You know, or what they don't say is we're collecting, and this is more germane to our conversation, we're collecting data on your driving habits, how far you drive, where you drive, you know, what, how long you spend at a particular location. And you start then collecting other data sets and combine it with that. And all of a sudden, you've got a real good profile on where Neil goes every day and how far he drives and what he does. And, you know, and okay, now what are you doing with that data set? Because the data set that you can you know, create is much more than whether I drive safely or not, whether I drive 35 miles an hour in the 35 zone, whether I stop suddenly or start suddenly or swerve. It is potentially much more than that. And so I would argue with you that 99.9% of consumers who may utilize those types of devices to try to drive down their auto insurance rates have no concept of what data sets are being created, and absolutely have no concept of how those data sets may be used.
So it's not related to data privacy at all, but I this is probably hashtag unpopular opinion, right? But you know, in the good thing about those devices, they do help you determine likelihood, which I think is is something we don't have in the cybersecurity industry, which makes it very hard for us to accurately risk, approach an organization to determine how likely they are to have a cyber attack, whether you talk about from a cyber insurance perspective or even from like a preempting attack perspective. I think there's, the good part of the program you described was that the data you got is used to help accurately, drive down insurance rates by helping to to refine those likelihood numbers. I wish we had something like that on the cybersecurity side.
Yeah, and they try, I mean, NIST has a self-assessment that you can do for, 800, 171, but you have to be kind of technologically conversant to even do it, right? And you're right. There is no mechanism right now that you can look at something and predict how vulnerable this or resilient a particular organization is, based upon their score or their posture, or, and you're right. I mean, in a perfect world, you have a little magic box you could hook up to somebody's network, and they go out and survey the network and determine how resilient or vulnerable that network is. But the only thing I'll say about that is, isn't that how Skynet started?
we can make the Skynet now.
We're going back to Skynet. Isn't that how Skynet started? Wasn't it supposed to look at the network and go out all on it and secure the network? And the next thing you know, you got Terminators flying around.
We're gonna pay homage to the Skynet overlord.
That's right. There you go. Cyborg.
That's right.
And so again, putting the conspiracy hat on, that's not necessarily the end all to be all, but I think there is something to be said about somehow determining actively a predictability score on whether a network is secure or not, whether a system is secure, whether a device is secure. There could be a lot of benefit to that if you could figure out how to do it, and make sure that as you do it, you have those guardrails in place to make sure that it's not abused and turns into Skynet or turns into, a system like in China where they're giving social scores. You could easily see where a system is put in place to determine network security that then, kind of goes to the dark side. And so you just have to be mindful of those sorts of things, I think, as you determine systems, as you determine privacy policies and cybersecurity policies and things like that. And, we go in and do assessments and look at things and, try to figure out where organizations are vulnerable. We do those all the time, but, there's no science. Well, there's a little bit of science to it, but it's also an art. I mean, because you're making gut calls and decisions and assigning scores based upon, what I would call subjective criteria.
So I, just because China is also an easy target to beat up on, but I do want to pick on a couple of things, kind of domestically and Chinese related, right? And so, again, keeping politics out of it, right? Recently, there was a large push by the administration to ban the download of TikTok and WeChat. As a matter of fact, it was supposed to happen this last Sunday, as they pose national security risk. TikTok is obviously a social media app, but for those who don't know, WeChat is a chat app. China has all but mandated that every business in China use WeChat to do their business. And so I've worked for several companies that have had large business initiatives where China has represented a large chunk of their revenue as a company. And so, there's a lot of investment in China, a lot of focus in terms of how to win business and how to be successful in China. And believe it or not, that success has come, because of, the business realizing that they had to conduct business on WeChat as an app. I worked for one med device company out there that, we tried as a cybersecurity organization to ban WeChat because we were worried about data loss over WeChat. And literally the entire China entity came to us and said, we will literally lose billions of dollars if you ban us, just from a company perspective, from using WeChat to conduct our business in. And so, with all that being said, just a couple days ago, federal court issued a preliminary injunction halting the administration's ban of the Chinese app WeChat, as well as I think subsequently it halted the ban on TikTok as well.
Right.
And so I guess my question over to you, Roy, is like, where is that fine line between banning Chinese written apps and violations of freedom of speech?
Well, okay, so everything is a balance. So you've got freedom of speech, but freedom of speech is there's no absolute right. And I think that's where people get confused sometimes. So for example, you have the freedom of speech, but you don't have the freedom to go into a crowded movie theater and yell fire, right? Um, well established kind of anecdotal legal principle, let's just say.
I was gonna say we've heard that one like 100 times every time we
Yeah,
talk about freedom of speech.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's the classic example that people use. And so, now in this situation, you're talking about balancing this perceived freedom of speech against national security, and the theft of intellectual property and all of those, which are very legitimate concerns. And again, not talking politics, but if you look at the F-35 and you look at China's version of their supersonic newest G-Wiz fighter, they look very similar, right? And so you say, well, why do they look very similar? That they, U.S. Companies and the Chinese companies on independent tracks just came up with very similar designs, or whether there was some intellectual property stolen. I'm not saying there was or wasn't. I'm just asking the question. And so, I think it is a legitimate concern to say, okay, what do we need to do from a national security standpoint and from an intellectual property protection standpoint to limit those types of thefts? And, if you can prove that those types of thefts are happening over WeChat, then you may need to take some sort of action against it, whatever that action may be. In the case of TikTok, they're getting information and collecting, again, these data sets. And the question becomes, what data set are they collecting and how are they using that data set? And if we don't understand that, and if we have the guardrails up and these are flying outside of the guardrails, then yeah, you probably should take some sort of action. But I think the first thing you have to have is the guardrails and determine, okay, where are those parameters around TikTok and what they're doing, or WeChat and what it's doing vis-a-vis our laws and regulations around software and data collection and aggregation and use and all those sorts of things. So, we kind of get back to legislation most times is going to be behind actual technology. And I think TikTok and WeChat are examples of that, of legislation, in this case, a presidential, I'm not going to say proclamation, executive order, banning these things is more reactionary than proactive in terms of trying to understand and get ahead of the issue rather than reacting to the issue. And I think right now we're reacting to that issue just like we react to most issues regarding cybersecurity and privacy. And reacting from a legal standpoint.
I think that's fair, and I'm trying to ask this question with the least amount of opportunity for controversy as possible,
Right.
because we've known for years, back in my days in the Air Force and then recently
Right.
here in the public sector.
I know where you're going,
Yeah.
but I'll let you ask the question.
Yeah, with ZT and Huawei. But why are we not taking the same type of paranoid approach, if we could call it that, with microprocessor companies coming out of China, which arguably exist in
Right.
way more devices in the United States and pose a much more in-depth cybersecurity risk because you can't even detect the type of malware that would exist on those microprocessors in the first place.
Right.
Instead of, is that an ignorance on our policymaker parts, that they don't recognize that chips have posed more of a national security danger than something like a couple of Chinese written apps?
It is. it's an ignorance thing, and and I think you and I are using ignorance the same way. It
Yeah.
just, you just don't have knowledge of it,
Right.
as
Right.
opposed to you're dumb.
Right.
But some may be, you know, but
Different conversation.
yeah, that's different conversation. Let's
Right.
just stick with you just don't have knowledge of it, and I think it is that to a certain extent. And again, I think a large extent is reactionary. So the 5G thing,
Yeah.
right? And the ban on Huawei and 5G networks and stuff like that. That's reactionary in
Hmm.
my opinion. What we needed to do before is to say, okay, certain types of microprocessors, to your point, that are developed, we just can't you can't use them in certain industries
Hmm.
here in the US, and those chips, because those chips present a problem. And I mean, in certain security circles, it was well known that you didn't use certain brand names of laptops, because those laptops had processors in them that were suspect, from a cybersecurity standpoint. And, it was a well-known fact. And so I think, but you didn't see anything coming out of the government that said it.
Hmm.
But, if I'll put it this way, if I knew, then surely people in the government knew.
Right.
And if they didn't, shame on them,
Right.
right? And so, again, I think we have got to get into a mindset of being more proactive in terms of our the ways we address technology, the ways we address cybersecurity, not only for against foreign threats, but also against just existential domestic threats. So that we don't have the Skynets of the world, so that we have a better handle on how artificial technology is used. And and it kind of transcends cybersecurity, and does go into technology. So I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, but when you start talking about genetics and gene therapies and how you manipulate genes and genomes, we've got genetically modified corn and soybeans and all those types of crops. But now we have the capability with CRISPR and some other technologies to modify human genomes, right? And so the question becomes, what are we thinking? Are we putting those guardrails up around that? No, we typically wait until it becomes an issue and then reacts to it. And that's what I think we see in cyber. And I think that's what we see in technology. And, I don't know the answer to that. I
Yeah.
don't know what we can do to address those types of issues proactively. Because, one of the things I always say in the cyber, the clients is, we have to think of cyber hygiene proactively. We have to be aggressive in how we are thinking about it, and not wait for something to happen and then react to that.
Yeah. Security guru guy asked a question. Asked to me, wouldn't the chips still have to send out data over the network? So wouldn't they be able to detect it? So you're not wrong, right? But you have to look at it in the sense of the chips are going to be the chips on, say, a computer are going to be able to hide their traces on the stack. Think about like
Right.
the ultimate level rootkit, right? That's
Yeah.
on the chip. But you're still going to have to know which network anomalies to detect on your IDSs
Right.
and IPSs or your proxies, and that's like looking for a needle in a stack of
Right.
needles.
Right. And can you actively do that for all the data that's passing through?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Because at that point, the burden of trying to do that, just to do it, is going to slow down your network. It's going to slow down your data, and the cost benefit in most people's minds isn't going to be worth it. So they're not going to do it. And then that's where you have the problem. They're just not going to do it because it is cost prohibitive. And when I say cost, I'm including the slowing down of data, the slowing down of processing and all of that sort of thing. So now that big quantum computer you bought isn't quite as quantum. Well, I want a quantum computer. I'm doing quantum processing, So yeah, you could, like you say, detect the anomaly, detect it if you knew what to look for and you were actively looking. We just aren't going to do that.
I think.
So
Go ahead.
you just have to say, okay, well, what can we do to address this situation? And is it a problem if that chip is in? I'm looking around my office to see what I could put that chip in, and it wouldn't be a problem. But conspiracy theorists, says it's going to be a problem in most things in my office. But should I have it in my computer? No. Should I have it potentially in my camera that has built-in microphones to it? No. Should it be in my handset on my, my phone, VoIP phone? No, because it is going to pose a security risk in those types of devices.
That's fair. That's it for the news section, and we're kind of coming up on the top of the hour. I've got a couple questions that I want to ask you, just since I've got your undivided attention. I want to remind everybody in chat, we are coming to the end of the stream, so let's make sure we get all the questions in that we have for Roy, about any topic, that might be of interest to get his perspective on. I think one of the ones that I wanted to ask you was specifically around the legality of bug bounties and responsible disclosures. And we've seen kind of this ping pong go back and forth between, researchers and companies. And, we've seen extreme cases of researchers getting sued / arrested over, various types of bug bounties and responsible disclosure type stuff. From a legality perspective and looking at it from the things that you view, what's kind of your take on bug bounty / responsible disclosure and the role of security researchers out there in the industry?
Right. So, I think, security research done correctly, and when I say correctly, responsibly, is a great thing. Because you have to remember, you've got scores of bad actors out there who all day, every day, are looking for the holes, looking for ways to exploit vulnerabilities, looking for ways to, kind of take advantage monetarily or otherwise of, any access or anything else they can do. That's what they do, and they do it very well. And so, to me, security researchers, if done correctly, are a legitimate and very valuable tool for the detection of issues, right? Now, whether you as a researcher find something and then say, okay, I'll give it to you for, if you pay me $100,000, otherwise I'm going to release it, then, now we're talking about maybe not done correctly, right? There should be no threats associated with it. But I think it's a valuable tool because you want to have bright minds trying to, help you identify issues or vulnerabilities before the bad actors can. So I think it's a legitimate tool, but it has to be done correctly and responsibly.
Who defines responsible disclosure? Because I think that's where the problem has really relied, right? Is because companies are left to define bug bounties and responsible disclosures all on their own. And so if we look at the AT&T example, and while it is definitely an extreme example, I think it is an example where AT&T didn't like the method in which a vulnerability was disclosed, and so therefore they pressed charges against them.
Right. And again, we're reactionary. So, there was a discussion a while back, and it resurfaces every now and then as to whether, we ought to have active defense, right? So whether corporate America should be able to actively, go against the bad guys, or the governments should actively be able to go against the bad guys from a cyber standpoint, do a denial of service attack on a bad guy to prevent them from doing stuff. So, we talk about those sorts of things. And I think, and we talk about whether we should have legislation around it and whether, it should be laws that permit those sorts of things. This is another one of those things we ought to be talking about, to say, okay, let's talk about what responsible is. Let's talk about legislatively, again, let's put some guardrails around this so that it's not just up to a company to say, okay, this is responsible, this isn't, but to give some guidance to it. Or let's just say you can't do it. Or if you do it, the company has to enter into a contract with them. But let's talk about it and define what that looks like so that we do have some parameters around it, so that good guys that are trying to help do the right thing and keep companies safe have a mechanism to do it. And it's not just the Wild Wild West, which is what it is right now.
Mm-hmm. So Edward kind of picks up on that, and he wants to ask a question. He says, "Is not done correctly worse than not done at all due to lack of incentive?" Slightly cynical approach, but I guess
right.
what
so,
is it? Go ahead.
It depends on which side you're on, and that's the easy answer. But I think, it just depends on whether not done correctly is better than not done at all. Because if it's not done at all, will the bad guys find it? They might. And, the outcome may be worse than not done correctly. Or they might not ever find it. They may not be technologically as sophisticated as the, I'm going to call them ethical hackers, and we'll debate whether they are or they're not, but we'll call them ethical hackers. And, they may not be as smart and they may never find it. So, in that case, if the bad guys never found it, well, then not done correctly is worse than not done at all. But if the bad guys were going to find it, then, not done at all is worse than not done correctly. So it just depends on if you could put your crystal ball on and rub it up good and get it shiny and clear and determine what the ultimate outcome would be. Then you can determine whether or not, which is worse or which is better. But we don't have that crystal ball. And because of that, all we can do is make best guess. All we can do is make assumptions, hopefully educated assumptions, hopefully educated best guess. But that's all we can do. And hope the outcome comes out like we want it to, or we would hope for it to.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective too. So we're gonna make a last call for.
That's the correct perspective. Come on, Neil.
We're gonna make.
Interesting. That's correct.
It is correct. Anything that you're legal counsel for literally
right.
everybody who's on this stream tonight. So they're gonna call you if they have a problem.
No, I'm not. We need another disclaimer. Sounds like.
So with that, I'm gonna make a last call for questions, and I'm gonna thank you, Roy, very much for being on the stream. I'm gonna turn it over to you, see if you've got any last minute thoughts, any last minute words of advice, or anything you want everybody to kind of take away with them as they walk away from the stream.
Yeah, what I would say is, we tend to think of cybersecurity and privacy in a box. We want to define very clear guidelines around it. We want those guardrails to be clear. But for us, as I'm going to assume most people on this call are cybersecurity professionals or privacy professionals in some form or fashion. And so the challenge for us is to always put our imagination caps on and to think of the what ifs and try to think of the what might happen if type scenarios, because everything is changing, everything is morphing, and so there's an old adage in war and battle, and that is don't fight the last war, or don't fight the last battle. And what that means is what happened last week, but you can't gear up to fight that battle. You have to be thinking, and we as a group have to be thinking about, what does that next battle look like? What does that next war look like? Because that's what it is. And then to try to imagine what our defenses will be, what those defenses will look like, and start to put them in place. One of the biggest things that we can, fail at is a failure of imagination, a failure to think of the possibilities and to try to define cybersecurity and privacy according to, some kind of preset conditions or preset parameters. And what I would challenge everybody on this call to do is to take those blinders off and really try to look at privacy and cybersecurity in a more holistic fashion, with the thought that everything in this world is morphing, everything in this world is changing, and we just have to be prepared for that. Every day I see instances of where the bad actors are just getting more and more creative, and you say, wow, I've never seen that before. But in some respects, I would say to everybody on this call, we should have imagined that happening. We should have thought about that happening. So it's really less words of wisdom than a challenge to everybody here to put our thinking caps on, put our imagination caps on, and let's be creative in our approach to cybersecurity and in our approach to how we think about privacy and how those two and technology all meld together with everyday life.
Awesome. Awesome. And speaking of challenges, our chat is never devoid of challenges, especially when I make a last call for questions.
Right. I'll take some more.
All right,
good.
we'll take some more here. We got so Security Guru Guy's got a question. He says, I have heard the idea floated that companies should be able to hack back with a blessing from the government, like the Merchant Navy did back in the birth of our nation. Right. Do you think that would be a good idea legally?
And that's what I was talking about before, making reference to as to, whether, the good guys ought to be able to do denial of service attacks against bad guys to keep them out of the networks and just take away their capabilities to do battle. Whether we allow corporate America to do it or whether we have a more unified approach, i.e. the government is doing it, which arguably it may be already, but is that a legitimate type of cybersecurity? One might argue it is, because if you look at cybersecurity as a war, as a battle of attrition, which in a lot of ways it is, then if I'm worried and my light cuts off, so that's why if you wonder why I keep I keep backing up every so often, I have to prove that I'm alive to my light switch. But if you look at it as a battle of attrition, and if you think of just warfare, if you are worried about the anti-aircraft guns taking out your bombers, then what do? You send fighters in to take out and missiles in to take out the anti-aircraft guns. And so, then the question becomes, in cyber warfare, is it legitimate to take out the offensive capabilities of, your adversary? Same kind of scenario. It's just played out on a different battlefield. And so you have a lot of people that will say, that's a legitimate cybersecurity warfare type operation, namely to take out the offensive capabilities of your adversary. Now, the difference would be, in typical warfare, you have countries and governments fighting against other countries. You don't have, a U.S. company in war fighting against a foreign company. You just, and so that's the issue that you have to overcome, is whether it's legitimate for corporate America to wage warfare.
Awesome. All right, cool. We are definitely at the top of the hour. Roy, I want to thank you again for
Pleasure's mine.
Literally being on the stream, and thank you on behalf of all of our viewers. All of our viewers, stick around. We are going to pick a random channel to raid, so we do want to go kind of support some other streamers in that. Roy, I'm going to ask you to hang out over in Zoom if you want to.
Okay.
If you got to go because you got to go do family stuff, then go ahead and we'll catch up tomorrow for a debrief. But
Okay.
it's up to you.
Okay.
Um,
I'll hang out.
okay. All right. Everybody,
Now
thanks.
here's the question for you though. If I'm hanging out, will they see my picture?
No, they're not going to see your picture.
Okay.
They're not going
All
to see
right.
your
I'll
picture.
hang out then. I just
would
wanted
you
to
Would
make
you
sure
like for people to see you while I give my outro?
well, I had my makeup on and I just didn't want, I didn't know whether I needed to refresh it or
No,
not.
you can go ahead and start taking your jacket off and everything else. Nobody's going to see you.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks all. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us for tonight. Again, everybody stick around a little bit. We're going to go rate another streamer. Show some support for another streamer in the community. As always, you can catch us here every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday from 7 to 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. Hopefully you enjoyed the stream. We're always welcome to feedback. You can either DM myself or DM one of the moderators and let us know with any feedback that you've got from the stream. Appreciate literally all of our new followers for the stream. You're welcome to the family. We're glad to have you here. If you enjoy the stream, make sure you hit that follow button. If you're still undecided, hit that follow button, hit that subscribe button. Make sure you check out all of our social media accounts over at Twitter and YouTube. And as always, everybody just remember to keep learning. For up-to-the-minute cybersecurity news, make sure you follow and subscribe to the Cyber and Security channel on Twitch and YouTube. Also, make sure you turn on those notifications so that you know when we go live.